Hello, I'm Donna Williams, and I wanted to do a video about terminology in the DID community. I guess the first place to start is the term dissociative identity disorder is a dissociative disorder, which is part of a spectrum of dissociative disorders. In other words, the problem is people dissociating, and dissociating in the case of DID is so compulsive, and the form of dissociation in DID is that the person dissociates into a range of different identities. So it's called dissociative identity disorder. There's a number of dissociative disorders that are on a spectrum of dissociative disorders. So some people, you can kind of think of it as dissociation light or dissociation that's more complex. So, for example, one of the terms in the DID community is that people will experience derealisation as well as dissociation. So just to dissociate is to cut yourself off from an experience. And so we all dissociate, all human beings dissociate. When you, for example, going for an operation or getting your teeth done, or having, some kind of a exam that you can't cope with, being a passenger in someone's car you don't want to be in, or being in a relationship you can't cope with or relate to, having to be friends with someone you don't get along with, having to work with someone who is really, you're finding really challenging to work with. There can be a whole range of reasons why you will cut off from what you're doing, and still part of you will go through the motions of being there, but it's not like your whole self is there anymore. Or you might have a certain part of you that goes and does that thing, and then you will go home and back to your usual life. And that's normal, and little children commonly dissociate. It's very common for children to dissociate to cope with new experiences, and that's why dissociative disorders are not diagnosed in most young children. That's why a dissociative disorder is really not diagnosed until it's natural for children to grow out of compulsive dissociating. So even though dissociative identity disorder begins usually before the age of 6, almost always before the age of 6. So it has its origins in anywhere from 6 months, 2 years old, up to about the age of 6. Usually it won't be diagnosed until the person is in adulthood. So I guess the important thing there is that dissociation is common. Dissociation is normal, especially in children. But where it's become compulsive and where the person has established so many identities that allow them to continue to dissociate, and that's become their normality, then that is why it's moved from being just a normal experience progressively into a dissociative disorder. So another experience that happens in people with dissociative disorders is derealisation. Derealisation is the feeling that you're not sure this is really your life, or you just feel maybe this isn't really your body, or you don't really feel like you recognize your face, or you can't really relate to your name. You're out of sorts. It's dereal. It's unreal. There's a feeling that you're foreign to your own life. And we all have this. So if you have been under extreme stress and you're overwhelmed, you will probably feel at some point some derealisation, but there are people who experience this a lot, and one of the reasons they might experience it is because there's so many different identities that that when they come back to presenting in the body, they are kind of confused about whose life it is. But derealisation does not just occur in people with DID. Derealisation commonly occurs in people who have, for example, schizotypal personality disorder, and in people who have borderline personality disorder, and they may or may not have DID, because DID can occur in people, all kinds of people, people with and without personality disorders. You will notice that DID doesn't have the term personality disorder in it, and that's because we all have personalities, and we in fact all have multiple personalities. All human beings have different personality traits that kind of glue together as a fruit salad to present as an overall personality. But a lot of people are not the same personality in every job, in, you know, who they are at home, who they are with this friend, who they are when they go to the doctor. So all human beings are multiple personalities, and that's why the term MPD was replaced with DID, because people were confused that if they took on different roles and presented different parts of them in different places, did this mean that they had dissociative identity disorder? No. And some people will do that more than others. So dissociative identity disorder is not something that people choose. It's not a comfortable way to live. It's not something that people enjoy because it makes them more interesting or exciting. DID is not a bunch of roles that people take on. DID is not someone who was highly imaginative and sat in a corner thinking up how to become new people. DID is what happens to people who've been through extreme chronic trauma from very early childhood, where the only way to mentally, emotionally, and physically stand what they were dealing with was to continually split off into being another identity, and they let that compartmentalize the abuse. So different parts hold on to different parts of abuse. And so in my case, some different parts of me, different alters, may have had quick switching during an abusive event. And so there's no whole picture of the event, because that is actually held by, say, 3 or 2 or 4 different parts of me. And until each one knows about what the other one dealt with, all each one can see is a piece of what happened. So another thing that happens in people with dissociative identity disorder is depersonalisation. And depersonalisation is something, again, all human beings have experienced. It's where the person cuts off from how personal this experience is. So we all depersonalize all kinds of things. We know we have to go to the doctor, we have to let them handle our body. So we say, oh, well, it's just because I'm sick and it's just the body and it's not me. Or we will say, I'm with this person because I'm helping them. It's not really, I'm not really engaged here. I'm just in a helper role. We might get really formal and distant because we're scared of the degree to which somebody else is getting overly involved or getting too close, and so we might become detached, formal, cut off, or we might say that our self doesn't really matter, that we're just on autopilot, we're depersonalized. And so there's certain types of personality disorders where depersonalization is normal. For example, in schizoid personality disorder. And that doesn't mean the person has DID. And someone with DID could have also schizoid personality disorder or not, because it can occur in any type of human being. In DID, there will be people with alters, other parts, other selves. Sometimes they'll call themselves. And an alter is not the same as a role. So there are people who will regularly live their life as a series of roles, and that's not the same as DID. That's very common in borderline personality disorder. It's common where people have lacked social skills and they've learned to mirror the expectations or behaviors of other people. So there might be many people on the autism spectrum who have some difficulty with social skills, who might learn to do things in certain roles, and that doesn't mean they have dissociative identity disorder. You can have people with DID who have autism, who may also learn some behaviors of how to behave like non-autistic people, and that's just running alongside the fact that person might also have DID. It's not the same thing. It just can co-occur. So a person can have an alter who is good at roles and can have alters that don't do roles at all. So role playing is nothing associated with the splitting, the dissociation that occurs in DID. A lot of people don't like the word alters, and when you have alters, they don't think they're alters. They see themselves originally as selves very often. So to realize that they're not alone, to realize there are others in there, that they are not the only one, to realize that the others are not just going to go away and leave them with the body to live their own whole life, to realize they are alters in a system, to realize they have to cooperate with other parts, other alters that they feel they have nothing in common with, sometimes really resent, sometimes are really afraid of, or feel completely unrelated to the other alters inside the system. When you help them to understand they're an alter in a DID system, can be really hard for them, a real struggle. It's, I don't know, it's kind of like thinking that you're male and then realizing, no, you're actually female, or I can't really describe it. It's just a very hard adjustment for some alters to realize they actually are alters. And so some people prefer to call them parts of the self. Some alters feel that's really distasteful to be referred to as a part. They feel reduced, so some people will call them selves. They'll say, I have many selves. And I guess the difference between a self and a role is that a self is multidimensional. So a role is usually, oh, this is the one that does the cooking, or this is the one that does sex, or this is the one that does whatever and goes to work. And a self or an alter is different because they have a number of things. So, for example, one of mine is highly analytical and very encyclopedic and very good at everything associated with helping the body, and very good at stuff to do with justice, and very much the one that can take charge and is quite a protector. But there's nothing in that says why that part particularly likes classical music, or likes certain types of colours, or has these particular kinds of friends and doesn't like those ones, or and that one has its own history, its own beliefs about itself, its own beliefs about its origins, and so there's another one. It's quite comedic and escapist and surreal, but there's nothing about that would say why that one particularly likes to collect stamps or enjoys goldfish. So I think you can get some idea about why a self is different to a role. It's got more substance. So when you meet someone who has a series of roles, you kind of feel no one's there. But when you meet someone who has alters that are selves, whole selves, I mean, they're not the core self and they are not the only self, but you still feel like you are engaging with a person who has dimension. Yeah, so I hope that explains. Switching is one of the terms used in DID. And switching means where a person jumps from one alter to another. And this can be in different people. So an alter can stay for a week, can stay for a month, it can stay for a year. You can have 5 switches in 30 seconds. You can have somebody staying, for half the week, and then suddenly, there's several in an hour. So how alters switch can be very different. And there's no paint by numbers example to it. There's people who I guess like to emulate DID, or they find it exciting or interesting as a condition. And it's not like there's some, here's how DID works, some paint by numbers version of it, because I've met now a number of people with DID and how their systems work, how switching works for them, or everything. We're all very different. Transitions, I prefer to think of transitions not as a word for switching. Some people use it as a word for switching, but for me a transition is where an alter identifies in a certain way and then slowly begins to transition into a different identification. So in my system, 2 of my alters identified as male, and it was really harrowing and hard for them to come to identify as female, but it was progressively really important towards integration, that they could understand and come to terms with why they had identified as male and why they were so frightened of female identity. There were some in my team who had identified extremely strongly against attachment. They felt quite impervious to hurt, and it was really important that they could transition towards coming to terms with why they identified that way, and through this they got closer to some of the others they had been quite nervous of, who were quite vulnerable. Some of the animal alters transitioned to understanding how they came about and that they were in fact children and not animals. And so for me, transitioning is part of the integration process where huge differences between alters become less extreme differences in the process of building cooperation and identification between inner selves, to the point where they can live cooperatively and not want to tear each other apart, tear apart the life of the overall person. Okay, there are things like fugues, and not all people with dissociative disorders will have fugues. I went through a time in my 20s where I would find myself at the beach, or find myself away from home for 3 days and think, how did I stay here? How did I forget where I live? And it's very frightening when it happens to you. And at the time, I think parts of me just forgot where we lived, or in their history we didn't live in those places, so they just kept going on. Some of them believed that we were homeless, and at that time we had somewhere to live. So, but in their world, and the last time they'd been around, we were homeless, or they couldn't remember the place that we lived. So that was their belief. And but I haven't had fugues since my 20s, but I do know what they're like, and they're nothing that I would glorify or find exciting, or think. I think if people want to act out having DID, then great. Tell yourself you're an actress and go act it out. But really, it's just so odd if you have it that people would want to lust after knowing what it is so they can portray it. Because if you lived it, it'd scare the hell out of you. Amnesia. The idea that people drop to the floor and have complete unconsciousness, and I think in real life, amnesia is things like finding that someone's thrown out all your underwear, or given away your most important objects, or decided that they don't eat a certain thing, so it's not in the cupboard, but then you find out it's a part of you that's done all of that. Or where friends haven't heard from you for months, or even sometimes years, and you've forgotten all the part that's there, didn't know of those people, or just felt that they were an acquaintance, or felt unfamiliar with them, and so that's more like how amnesia plays out. It's like having other people who are stealing pieces of your life or each other's lives. They're trying to run their own lives. The problem is that their own lives are also different to each other, that they don't realize that they're actually disrespecting some other part. They just arrive and think, what is this here for? And so they try to sort it out according to their own life, and then another is back and thinks that someone's been here and taken things. So it's kind of like that. Co-consciousness is, I remember walking down the street, and part of me would be happy and having a good day, and there'd be another part that would be screaming and crying, and it's like you can feel it. It's like a ghost hanging around. It really just feels like a ghost just here. And sometimes one will be singing, or saying silly words or something. It's not like hearing voices outside of your head. It's not it's not schizophrenic delusion stuff. It's really just like ghosts are hanging around. Once you begin to be co-conscious with each other and know who these people are and know how they each identify and what they call themselves and what their idea of their own history is, then when you're walking along and one's singing, you go, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. If they switch through, maybe you're the one who's in there singing or crying or laughing. And once you develop co-consciousness, it's not as confusing as when you first start having it. When you first start having co-consciousness, it's very disorienting. But even in childhood, one of my alters did have co-consciousness with two of the others, and that one, because we were children, it was kind of normal. It was your imaginary friend, even though nobody had imagined these friends. They made themselves up. They just were discovered that they exist, that they were already there. So I think children can relate more to co-consciousness, and when as an adult you're having more of this with alters you didn't even know were in there, I think it's very harrowing. Presenting is the one who's come to the front. So if you imagine a bus and there's somebody sitting in the driver's seat, there might be somebody in the passenger seat or just behind, and there's others way up the back of the bus. So presenting is where people have got closer to the driver's seat. A system is the collective group of alters. Some people don't like the word system. It's very clinical. I use the term team. It's my team. Within a team or a system, you can have subsystems. So in mine, we understood all the alters, and then all of a sudden there were these others. And I realized that nobody in my team really knew about them except one, and she had gone into denial about them, but they were part of her own team, her subsystem. As we progressively move towards integration, they developed little subfamilies. They remembered when they had split off from each other, who, how this one was a denied part of this one, things like that. And so they then formed alliances, identifications, little subfamilies within the whole system. And I think that's actually really constructive. In the types of alters, there's what's called core self. And the core self, I've met people with DID who had a core self the whole time, but they still had alters and had split off from the core self. In my case, the core self had become like an automaton by about age 4. So before 4, there were lots of really strong emotions, mostly about really extreme distress at having a body, really struggling to be expected to interact and speak. And so although my core self was still there, it became a monitor, a watcher, the person who would type and be like a conduit for all others. So more like almost like a medium that would provide a channel for the others. And when the core self realized it did think and feel personally in its own right, the others were really shocked because they barely credited the core self as even an alter. It was considered a very minor alter. And when this part really began to step into the voice and take on many of the jobs and friendships and everything in life, which is very strange to suddenly realize you've been kind of dormant or asleep or semi-dead for, decades, and now you are stepping into this really foreign life, a life that your other selves developed in your absence. It's very odd, but I'm glad that my core self did wake up, because there are people whose core self was so destroyed and damaged that it really stayed in that lost, cut-off state while the other alters continued to do life. What's called a host is the one that is mostly present in the body. So for a long time, Willie was our host, and the others would still come out, particularly Polly and Anne, but usually once the door was closed and safe from the world, and then they would present. So Willie is obviously a protector alter, which is another term you might hear. But progressively, some of the others became almost like co-hosts. So for a while, Da and Willie were both hosting. And it depends on how long someone stays and how much of the general overall life they've taken over. And then once I was present as the core self, and stepping into the functions that my alters had made, called this, my life, I became the host as well as the core self. There are what's called littles, and littles are alters who are stuck in time. So particularly Polly was very stuck, and around 3 to 5. And there were reasons for that. There were things that happened around 4 to 5 years old that she just couldn't go past. So she went backwards and stayed there. And she's just beginning to come to terms with who was there in her place after that, who was her older self that she couldn't dare to connect with. And there was Carol, who was also quite a little, and she was really emotionally kind of around 7 to 9, and sometimes more like 5 to 9. But they've both made a lot of progress, and Carol has come to terms with a part of her that she had been unable to face, because it's a lot more vulnerable. It went through things she couldn't face that had been part of her that had gone through it. And so littles can grow up, but they don't necessarily grow up like a separate physical person. They might grow up because they integrate with a part that was a part of them that had split off and dealt with abuse when they were older, but has become healthy enough for them to come together with that part. Animal alters, I developed 3 that I came to terms with. And again, I was really quite dormant in this, and it was actually one of my alters, who is Polly, who originally would take on all the sounds and behaviours of these different animals. And then as she went dormant, they took lives of their own, in a sense. And so in the integration process, it's like, well, I understand the team who lived my life in my dormancy, and then each of them understand the ones who lived in their place and who they are. So animal alters generally come about because people have experienced animals being tortured and killed. And one of the ways that children cope with that is that they keep the animal alive by becoming the animal. They might also become animal alters because they've been through neglect and they've been treated like an animal, or because perhaps there were kinds of abuse that they felt wouldn't have happened to an animal. So there's a range of reasons why children develop animal alters. And the problem as an adult is that occasionally they're still there, they come out, and they need to be accepted, and they need to have a way that they can feel safe enough to get back to confronting how they originally got there, and that they are part of a human team. Object alters, I had one where one of the team would stare at a snooker ball until feeling they had become this solid granite ball. And that one is actually quite good at becoming a whole range of inanimate objects, and it's easy to understand why an inanimate object can't be abused, why you would want to absorb your whole soul into an object. There was also one in the team who had stereotypies, which is kinds of behaviours that are associated with things like brain injury, common in people with autism. And that one, there was a lot of abuse about the whole being a spastic thing. And if you have that stuff, it can be easier to just try and lose the body and become something that never moves. And so it's kind of like how you become catatonic to feel that whatever happens to you didn't matter because you weren't a human being. So there's nothing really, so fantastically glorious about having DID. accept perhaps the fact that the people who've been through horrendous abuse have survived because of this mechanism. I hope that the exploration of the terminology has been useful.